Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Pierre Dennery, and I'm the country manager for France at Aurora. I'm here today with Julia Breuing, research associate at Aurora in the pan-European team in charge of European carbon markets. With Julia, we are thrilled to have Guillaume de Goÿs with us today. Welcome, Guillaume.
Thank you.
A few words about our distinguished guest today. You're an engineer by training. You started your career in the tire industry at Michelin before moving on to the aluminium industry, first in Cameroon and then in France. In 2014, you took over as the managing director for Aluminium Dunkerque, the largest aluminium smelter in Europe and a global leader in the production of low-carbon aluminium. You are now the CEO of Aluminium Dunkerque. You're also active in various industry associations as President of Aluminium France, the French Association for Aluminium Industries, and board member of the UNIDEN, the association representing the interests of the energy-intensive industries in France. Before we start this interview, I'd like to give a few figures about Aluminium Dunkerque for our audience. As mentioned previously, Aluminium Dunkerque is the largest aluminium smelter in Europe, with a production capacity of up to 286,000 tons per year. It is also the largest electricity consuming site in France, using up to 4 terawatt hours per year. To put things in perspective, that's twice as much as the second largest consuming site in France. It's also the equivalent of the consumption of Marseille, France's second largest city. Or if you want another figure, it's about 1% of the total power consumption in France. So on this show, we usually discuss with the CEOs of energy producers, with government decision makers or regulators. But today we wanted to hear from the energy consumers, and I think you are probably best placed for that. We'll talk about the challenges faced by a company like yours, from tariffs to electricity and carbon prices. There is plenty of news recently, from Trump's tariffs on aluminium to the EU Clean Industrial Deal and the upcoming implementation of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So let's get started. Donald Trump confirmed at the beginning of March the implementation of a 25% tariff on all imports of aluminium to the US. Last year, electricity prices in France fell to 50 euros per megawatt hour on average, but that's compared to $30 in the US. And overall, I would say the industrial demand in Europe has been quite sluggish. So I would like to start with a broad question for you. What do you think, out of the ones that I've mentioned before, and maybe others, what do you think are the biggest challenges that you currently see for aluminum producers in Europe?
The biggest challenge for us, it's clearly the energy price. You've described it quite well in your introduction. Aluminium industry by nature, and especially the aluminium primary production, is very electro-intensive. We consume a bit more than 13 to 14 megawatt hour per ton of aluminum that we produce, making our industry one of the most electro-intensive that we have. So, of course, we are very, very sensitive to the variation of the electricity in the market that we serve and where our smelters are located. So being in Europe has not been very quiet in the recent years, with the price that you've mentioned, which are still largely above prices that we can see elsewhere in the world. And we went through a very big crisis in 22-23 with electricity prices on the market reaching up to 300 euros per megawatt hour, forcing us to curtail partially or totally our production. It's worth to note that the primary aluminium production in EU has dropped by 40% during those 2 years. So that's the biggest challenge that we are facing. The second point that you mentioned is related to trades. Aluminium is a commodity and it's global by nature. So the price of aluminium is fixed on a global level by the London Metal Exchange, the LME, and that's where we get our price. So, of course, if some producers are using cheap electricity, it's very difficult to compete as we have the same price and cost, which could be very, very different from one region to the other.
the all-in power prices, so including network fees and taxes, where do they need to be for Europe to remain competitive versus international competitors?
The main region where the primary production is competitive, that's where energy is affordable. Typically, that's Canada, Iceland, Norway, Middle East, and some other area of the world where they burn coal or gas at low prices to produce electricity. So the average prices that they have access to are the cheapest are probably below 10 euros per megawatt hour, and the average is around 25 to 30 euros per megawatt hour. So to be really competitive on a global level, we need to have access to this kind of prices, all-in prices, as you mentioned, because we have several mechanisms, and we will enter, I think, in the detail of those mechanisms a bit later in the interview. The biggest one is the indirect CO2 compensation, which is absolutely needed for us to stay producers of primary aluminium in Europe.
Now, the European Commission tried to tackle those challenges also with the new industry strategy that was released end of February with the so-called Clean Industrial Deal. With this Clean Industrial Deal, they want to find a balance between decarbonization goals and also industrial and trade policy objectives. To preempt a bit, it is rather a summary of roadmaps and action plans and not yet a very, very concrete strategy. So it's probably too early to truly judge its effectiveness. But at a first glance, do the action plans in the Clean Industrial Deal set the right impulses, and is anything missing in your view?
So clearly, the Clean Industrial Deal is the first step in the right direction, recognizing the importance of the industry in Europe and recognizing the fact that if we just apply the Green Deal as it was designed, in the Fit for 55 package, for example, it's really, really difficult to keep industry in Europe. And the Clean Industrial Deal, while keeping the targets to decarbonize our industry, is clearly recognizing the challenges that we face and propose some options to reduce the price of energy, for example, but also limit the regulatory burden to recognize that some area of our industry needs support. So that's, as I said, going in the right direction. Now, especially on the energy, we don't see a major change coming in force in the coming months or even years, because the actions that have been decided or that are described in that plan are more for the long term. It's mainly depending upon the full implementation of renewable energy and the better integration of the energy market between the countries. And we know that all those actions will take a lot of time. So it's difficult to say, okay, that's good, we have the Clean Industrial Deal, because we know that it won't be enough.
So it is more urgent than can be addressed by the Industrial Deal.
Yes. Especially with the other threats that we have with the tariff war that has been launched by the US, and which of course will hurt the economy. And aluminium, as I said, it's a commodity, so it's really dependent on the consumption. And the GDP is very important to support our industry. And given all those uncertainties, we need to have some certainty to continue to invest, and especially to invest in decarbonation. That's something which is important. The industrial deal, it's a clean industrial deal, so we are not forgiving our targets to decarbonize our industry and to decarbonize it. And maybe we can go a bit more into detail regarding Aluminium Dunkerque, but our decarbonation plan, they are important for us, and we need to invest hugely in our installation in order to be able to reduce our CO2 footprint.
Yeah, so one of the other measures that is mentioned in the Clean Industrial Deal, so we've already covered the topic on affordable energy, but one of the other measures are the so-called lead markets, with which the European Commission plans to increase demand, especially for steel and cement. And with those lead markets, the Commission wants to introduce selection criteria in public procurement, to increase the demand for EU-made clean products. Is this something that could also be beneficial for the aluminium sector? And if not, why is it not as suited as for steel?
So clearly, it's a good idea to have kind of made in Europe policy, and it's important if we want to really go in the right direction in terms of climate change, because the products that are made in Europe, especially true for aluminium, are generally less carbon intensive compared to the products that are made elsewhere and that we import in Europe. Typically for aluminium in France, the average CO2 footprint of a ton of aluminium that we produce, it's 4.5 tons of CO2 per ton of aluminium produced. The European average, it's closer to 8, and the world average, it's closer to 12. So every ton of carbon that we import from outside Europe is more carbonized compared to the one that we produce in Europe. So if we favor the European aluminium production, then it's a good direction towards the Clean Deal that we have.
And one of the measures that is currently already in place and that you've also mentioned to create a kind of level playing field for domestic producers compared to international producers is the indirect emission compensation. And with the indirect emission compensation, aluminium producers are compensated for the carbon costs that are embedded in the power price. Why is it such an important measure in the status quo?
So that's completely related to the way the European electricity market works. As you know, the electricity market in Europe, the price is made by the last power plant that is used. And if that's a carbonized power plant, then the price is set by the carbonized power plant for every trades that are made in Europe. So the price of electricity in Europe, even in countries like France or like Norway, where the CO2 content of the French grid is quite low, the price is set by the European market. So there is almost always carbon CO2 content in the price that we pay. So the way the indirect CO2 compensation works, it's to compensate partially, that's currently 75%, of the embedded carbon price that we pay in our electricity bills. And that's very important because it depends, of course, on the carbon emissions that you have in your country where you are producing. But it could be up to 20, 30 euros per megawatt hour that are reimbursed on your bill, depending on the carbon emission and the various factors that are used to calculate the indirect CO2 compensation. So for us, typically, a smelter like we consume, as you said, Pierre, at the beginning of this emission, we consume 4 terawatt hours of electricity per year. So plus 10 euros per megawatt hour, that's plus 40 million in terms of electricity bill. And minus 10, it's minus 40 million of electricity costs. So that's huge. That's the second largest cost that we pay just after the raw materials for a smelter.
And from next year onwards, under the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, importers to the EU need to pay the same carbon price as domestic producers for direct emissions, at least for aluminium.
Yes.
And there are discussions to extend this also to indirect emissions. Would this justify then a phase out of the indirect emission compensation?
So clearly we see that as a risk for 2 or 3 reasons. First, the inclusion of the indirect emissions will be very, very difficult to trace. We know that it's already difficult to have the direct emissions properly recorded and declared by the CBAM, and the data that we have seen for the preliminary phase in 24-25 are showing a very big difference in the quality of the data that are recorded. So, and that's only for the direct emissions. So for the indirect emissions, that's more difficult. So that's the first reason. The second one, it will increase the cost of aluminium in EU by a very large factor. As I told you, the indirect emissions for the primary production is very big compared to the direct emissions. So it will increase the price of the aluminium in Europe by a factor of 30 to 40%, depending on where the aluminium is coming from. And that would imply competition with other materials, which will be absolutely not favorable to the aluminium and creating artificially an uneven playing field. So that's the second reason. And the third one, It's the risk of resource shuffling. What does it mean, resource shuffling? Typically, China, which is the largest aluminium producer in the world, they produce 44 million tons of primary aluminium with a global production of 70 million. So that's plus or minus 60% of the global production. And they have 90% of that production, which is based on coal or gas, and 10% which is based on hydro. 10% of the 45 million, that's 4.5 million. That's more than all European aluminium production. So you can just imagine that China, without changing anything to its average indirect emissions, they could direct the aluminium which is made from hydro to Europe. They will not pay any taxes for the CBAM, indirect taxes for the CBAM, and without any change to their average production. So that's what we call the resource shuffling, where you use the green aluminium or the so-called green aluminium, and you pretend to use it to send it to Europe, where the rest is staying in China, or exported to country where there is no such carbon scheme. So that's the three main risks that we see, and that's why we don't want to have the inclusion of the indirect in the CBAM, at least in the first phase. When the CBAM proves to be efficient, then we can discuss, but really at a later stage.
We've discussed the measures taken at EU level, their benefits, but also their limitations just now. I think that was very interesting, the concept of resource reshuffling. I'd like to focus now a bit more on what can be done by the industry itself to improve the competitiveness of its power supply. So two instruments come to mind, PPAs and flexibility, which are two topics that we discuss a lot in our podcast usually. So maybe starting with PPAs, do you think they will play a role for an industry like yours, especially renewable PPAs?
So typically, we have two things which are much needed for the aluminium industry. The first one, that's the visibility. As I told you, we need to invest heavy amounts to decarbonize our industry. And in order to be able to do those capex, we need to have visibility. So PPAs, which are generally 10, 15, 20 years PPAs, are giving us this kind of visibility. So that's a very good point. The second point, which is important, that's the competitiveness of the electricity prices that we have. And unfortunately, currently, we don't have such competitiveness for PPAs because the price is mainly dictated by the market prices. Even if the PPAs are as produced and should be given at or offered at a production price, what we see, it's mainly driven by market prices. So that's something which is really preventing us to enter in those PPAs. And the third point, which is especially the case for the renewable PPAs, not hydro, not nuclear, but renewable PPAs like wind or solar, the fact that our industry is a baseload industry. We can't adapt our production to the huge variation implied by pay-as-produced PPAs, and the firming costs are very big. It's variable from one country to the other, but could be very big, especially in countries where the share of renewable electricity is large, because the firming costs in such countries are very big and are still unpredictable on the long term, because the more you get renewable, the higher the cost of firming is. So that's the two reasons why the PPAs, especially the renewable PPAs, are currently not really a very good solution for the aluminium.
That's actually a good transition to the second part of my question. You say your consumption cannot adapt to the production profile of renewables, but can increased flexibility play a role in reducing your electricity costs?
Yes, indeed, it does. And that's especially the case for Aluminium Dunkerque, we have entered into demand response services for years now, where we've started more than 10 years ago. And we are offering a large kind of services from frequency containment to peak shading or even secondary reserve in order to help the grid to be stable. A smelter can be a good contributor to very short-term adjustment mechanism because we have the ability to stop and to restart for short periods, generally less than 2 hours, our production. When the variation are lasting more than 2 hours, it's more difficult because the thermal balance of the potline is affected, and then it's more difficult to restart. And after 4 hours, it's even impossible. And we are damaging the industrial equipments if those stops are lasting more than 2 hours. So we need to adapt, and we need to invest in demand response, and especially long-term demand response to be more flexible on the long term. But currently, the market is not giving us enough visibility to perform such investment. So if we want to increase the way the aluminium smelters are able to flexibilize their electricity demand, then we need to establish long-term market incentive, which currently doesn't exist.
Now we've talked a lot about competitiveness, and rightfully so. It's a very important topic at the moment. But one of the other key topics that you've also mentioned is, of course, decarbonization. And Aluminium Dunkerque aims to reduce direct emissions by more than 70% in all scopes by 2050 and already a big chunk by 2030. So what do you see as the major decarbonization options for the aluminium industry in the next decade and also in the long term?
So globally, the first option, that's to decarbonize the electricity. The indirect emissions are by far the largest emissions of the aluminium industry. And that's the first topic that we need to improve. Hopefully in France, and that's the case for Aluminium Dunkerque, we already are using decarbonized electricity, mainly thanks to nuclear and hydro. So this is already done for Aluminium Dunkerque. And our indirect emissions are less than 0.8 tons of CO2 per ton of aluminium produced, which makes us really leading the pack. The second challenge, that's the direct emissions. So currently sitting at an average of 2.2 globally, and Aluminium Dunkerque is at 1.8, mainly thanks to the various investment that we've made, and especially trying to reduce the carbon emissions that we have directly in the potline. So we have two options there. One that we are currently developing with some partners in a project that aims to develop carbon capture dedicated to the primary aluminium industry. We are developing that technology, carbon capture, which already exists, but we adapt it to the flue gases that we have, which are low concentration in terms of CO2, less than 1%. So we can't directly use the readily available technology. We need to adapt those technology to the concentration of the CO2 in the flue gases. And the second technology that we could use, that's what we call the inert anode technology, so replacing the carbonized anodes by inert anodes. But unfortunately, this technology, while being researched for decades, is not readily available at industrial scale. So some companies are working on that, and we are partnering with some of them to develop that promising technology, which is to replace those carbonized anodes by inert anode. And instead of producing CO2 in the potline, we will directly emit oxygen, which of course will be a major step forward for us. So in the low carbon aluminium projects that we have two steps. One which aims to divide by 2 our direct emissions by 2030 using the carbon capture technology, and one other which will use the inert anode technology when it will be available, so around 2040. That's what we have currently in the long-term strategy to increase the size of the site and to have a new potline based on that technology.
Thanks for the insights. Now, to conclude the podcast, a final question that summarizes your view on the current state of the industry. Are you rather optimistic or pessimistic about the future of heavy industry in Europe?
I'm always optimistic because it would be very difficult to drive such a big industrial company if I'm pessimistic. So I'm optimistic, but I'm informed. So it's a bit, we have challenges, but I think that some trends are changing at European Commission level. We already said that, but the Clean Industrial Deal is going in the right direction, maintaining the targets in terms of decarbonation, but also providing some support to keep the industry competitive in Europe, because we can't decarbonize our industry if we are not competitive, because if we are not competitive, we won't be there. And the decarbonization that we don't want is a decarbonization which will be the disappearance of the industry and the import of more carbonized products. So I'm optimistic that we will find a solution, but it will be difficult. It will really need collaboration between the various members of our ecosystems, public policies, but also private investments to tackle those challenges.
Great. So that's very reinforcing to hear. And with that, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us for this. It has been very insightful and a great pleasure to have you as a guest.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillaume.
That was Guillaume de Goÿs, CEO of Aluminium Dunkerque, talking to Pierre Dennery, Country Manager for France at Aurora, and Julia Breuing, Research Associate at Aurora in the Pan-European team in charge of European carbon markets. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.